So most of the evolution of life on the planet occurred in the oceans and the water, and it's actually only been relatively recently that we've had life moving onto land. Part of that is because I showed you guys that graph yesterday with the oxygen levels in the atmosphere, right?
Yesterday?
So oxygen levels used to be much lower in the atmosphere, and as we've had photosynthesis happening on the planet, photosynthesis actually caused that increase in oxygen in the atmosphere. And normal oxygen gas is O2, but up in the upper layers of the atmosphere, that O2 can actually be converted into ozone, which is O3, so 3 atoms of oxygen instead of 2. And you guys have probably heard of the ozone layer, right? Yeah. The ozone layer only formed when we had enough oxygen in the atmosphere to create that ozone in the upper atmosphere. And the ozone layer is really important for particularly land-based light because the ozone layer blocks UV radiation from the sun. So prior to the formation of that ozone layer, organisms that were living on land would have been constantly bombarded by UV light. So why is that a problem? Get out your clickers.
Yeah.
Why is UV light a problem? I didn't actually start today. One of these days. I did? Thank you. All right. Now that you all have a chance to figure it out, what is the problem with UV light? It's not clicking? No, it is. Okay. All right, click in if you haven't clicked yet. Anybody else? All right. Okay. So you guys cast your mind back to our evolution discussion. You may remember one of the major causes of mutation is actually UV light. Mutations, generally, on most of the time, good or bad? Usually bad. So prior to the formation of the ozone layer, it was very difficult for things to colonize land because it would have been so bombarded with UV light that it would have caused enough mutations to pretty much kill everything. So once we had that ozone layer, first plants and then animals started to colonize land. Why plants first and then animals?
It was easier for plants, like there was less required for them to get to a point where they could survive.
Yeah, well, there's less required. What would be required for animals? Food, exactly. So animals need a food source. Plants can make their own food. So plants went first, and then animals came and ate the plants, right? But animals couldn't move in until there were plants for them to eat because animals always have to eat something. They can't make their own food. Okay, all right, so that's it for that lecture. We're going to now move on to a discussion of plant diversity. So you'll notice I'm not doing the chapters exactly in order. The way the book organizes the chapters, I think, turns out to be a little bit odd. So I just lumped all of the diversity chapters in next to each other. So this whole unit, I'm basically talking about diversity of life, and we're now getting into plants. We got a whole lecture on plants, a whole lecture on fungus, a whole lecture on
There's a
animals.
whole
Yeah.
section of plants.
Okay, go.
How much is the time difference between like when animals and all land and plants?
I don't know the exact time difference.
Do you have like a super rough estimation?
It's probably in the realm of like, I would say within an order of magnitude of about 100 million years. Yeah, but it might be a bit less than that. It might be more along the lines of like tens of millions of years. Yeah.
are going up onto the land,
Yes.
which is rock,
Yes.
not soil.
Well, soil technically has organic matter in it. So
Right.
yeah, the first plants are probably, they're gonna be coming into a pretty inhospitable,
Rock, they have to turn rock into.
or sand, or silt. So there's some options there. And if you can imagine, okay, imagine the oceans, imagine there's algae. Algae gets washed up on shore, that's gonna rot
Organic
on
matter.
shore. There you got some organic matter.
Yes.
Yeah. And it probably started along the edges, as we're gonna talk about in just a second, land plants evolved from a type of green algae. So it probably was a type of green algae that started to,
Die on the shore.
well, die on the shore or live in intertidal zones. So it was partially exposed when there was low tide and underwater when it was a high tide, and gradually became more water resistant over time. So it's not like an instantaneous, this stuff washes up and all of a sudden it can live there.
Yeah.
It's something that can happen more gradually.
Right.
Yeah. Other questions? All right, so moving on to plant diversity. All right, so we're gonna start with a talk to your neighbor exercise here. What challenges do land plants face that aquatic algae does not? So this is a green algae. It is a multicellular organism, lives in the water. This is a land plant. So think about what this plant has to deal with that this algae does not have to deal with.
Reproducing in open air. Isn't that it? Reproducting in open air. In water. I can't remember, it was in the book last night. One of them was like reproducting in open air, so they have to have like sporophytes. And then the other one is photosynthesizing air, I think. They have to just deal with the air.
All right, so what kinds of things did you guys come up with? Yeah, so desiccation is a big thing. If you're surrounded by water, you don't really have to worry about conserving water because there's water all around you. If you're living on land, water conservation suddenly becomes super, super important. Yes?
Land plants have to use some of their energy to fight against gravity.
Yeah, you have to be able to support yourself. If you took this guy out of the water and plopped it on the land, it'd just go, right? It doesn't have any structural support because the water supports it when it's in the water. And so you gotta have some sort of structural support that allows you to fight up against gravity. What else? There's one other thing that we just talked about.
UV?
UV radiation. So that's another one that's really important. So yeah, you've got a lot of things that you have to deal with that you didn't have to deal with in an aquatic environment. So you see these adaptations to conserving and moving water around the body of the plant, protecting yourself from damage from UV radiation, and also supporting yourself against gravity. So all these things are things that the land plants have to deal with. So there are some characteristics that are you tend to see among the land plants across the board. One of those and one of the earliest adaptations to life on land is the cuticle. The cuticle is a waxy covering that covers the entire body of the plant and prevents water loss. Okay? What's the problem with being covered in a waxy covering? Imagine if you were completely covered head to toe with no gaps in a waxy covering.
No exchange of oxygen.
Yeah, you can't breathe, right? You can't exchange gases. So that is the trade-off. The cuticle is going to prevent water loss and also protect the plant from it helps to protect the plant from infection. To a certain extent, it helps to protect from UV light, but it prevents gas exchange. And so there are these stomata, or openings in the stem and leaves through the cuticle that allow for gas exchange. Now, for an animal, we need oxygen and we produce carbon dioxide. Plants often need carbon dioxide because that's what they use to photosynthesize. And as long as they are photosynthesizing, they will produce oxygen. Although, if they're not actively photosynthesizing, they actually do use oxygen. So plants tend to use oxygen at night and use carbon dioxide during the day. But in any case, they have to have those openings that allow for that gas exchange. Plants also have a variety of pigments that protect against UV radiation. A lot of times, pigmentation in general is something that can help protect cells from the high energy radiation from the sun. So those pigments will actually absorb the light and make the light cause less damage. So, of course, the pigment that allows for photosynthesis is chlorophyll, right? That's contained within chloroplast. That's what gives plants their green color. But plants actually usually have a lot more pigmentation than just the chlorophyll. You just can't see the other pigment colors underneath the green of the chlorophyll because there's so much green that the plant just appears green. But one example of where you might see that pigmentation in the fall, you know, when the plants are getting ready to drop their leaves, they actually break down and reabsorb the chlorophyll so that they can reuse the compounds that are in the chlorophyll. And then what color do the leaves turn?
Depends on what's left.
Yeah, exactly. And so the colors that the leaves turn when they break down the chlorophyll, those represent the other pigments that are present in the leaves. So those reds and yellows are other types of pigments, yes?
So for my house plants, it's better to just leave, even if they're not looking like all the other leaves. It's better to leave the yellowing leaves on there and let them reabsorb those.
Yeah,
those nutrients.
yeah, like, for example, last fall, we had a really early, really severe cold snap before the leaves dropped. I don't know if you guys noticed that, off the trees. And all the leaves were still green when we had that cold snap, and then the cold snap killed them, and then they just crinkled up and dropped off, kind of not in a normal fashion. That was probably extremely physiologically stressful on all of the trees in the area. It is better to let them reabsorb those nutrients so that they can reuse it
Elsewhere.
elsewhere.
New growth.
New growth, exactly. All right, so you got your pigments, and then we have the other thing that you tend to see in plants that we don't tend to see in the green algae is more specialized structures for particular functions. So if we look at this algae is more or less just a big sheet, right? It's not super complicated. If you look at land plants, they tend to have these different organ structures like the stems, the leaves, the roots, that are specialized to perform different structures rather than the whole plant doing kind of the same thing, all right? So those are some of the patterns that we tend to see in land plants. All right, our friend the phylogenetic tree. The sister group of land plants is some kind of green algae. You'll notice in the green algae are up here in green. You'll notice there's two different groups of green algae. This type of green algae would be the sister group to the land plants, because if you follow it back, you can see it shares a more recent common ancestor with the land plants than it shares with the green algae, the rest of the green algae. So if you had to put a name on the group of green algae in terms of describing what kind of group it would be, what kind of group is that? A paraphyletic group, exactly. It shares a common ancestor and some, but not all, descendants. So the common ancestor of green algae is also an ancestor of the land plants, but they're not considered to be green algae. So that's a paraphyletic group. Also, thinking about our different groups, I'm going to try, yeah.
This is kind of going back to what we were before.
Yeah.
So do you think it's possible that a plant can sort of unconsciously decide to put elements and compounds into a leaf and allow it to die in order to get it out of the rest of the system? Allow this one leaf to die.
Can a plant use a leaf to rid itself of its toxins or something like that?
Yeah.
Not per se. However, when we talk about plant defenses, there's one defense mechanism that plants have for infection, where if they get infected in a particular location within the body, they will allow that part of the body to die to protect the rest of the body. But they can't really sequester bad things into one area and then drop it, as far as I'm aware. Okay, so casting your minds back to our different groups of eukaryotes, what group of eukaryotes do the land plants and the green algae belong to? This is what we were talking about on Friday.
I have to look it up, but I think it's. I'm going that one. But it's not that one, it's archaeoplastics. Right? I can't remember the
Anybody else? I
Aquaculture,
think that's,
all
okay, there we
areas,
go. There is
including
no E. Someone can
animal,
say E.
plants, and fungi.
All right, fine, you wanna leave it on E, that's, okay, there we go, good. All right, so, everybody clicked in? Okay, cool. All right, so the land plants and the green algae, those belong to the archaeoplastids. About little less than half of you got that right, probably because you haven't started studying these different groups yet. I do want you to know these names, and kind of generally what's in each group, because it's important to understand what's related to what other things are related to. That wasn't English, but anyway. So the archaeoplastics, yeah, that's the land plants and the green algae. Excavates was things like the euglena, and sleeping sickness was the other excavate that I gave you an example of. Opisthokonts, animals and fungi. And then the stromenopiles was the brown algae, right? Yes?
I thought apostacons included plants.
Nope.
It's just animals and.
Just
fungi.
animals and fungi, and there was another thing in there.
And then archaeoplastids, all eukaryotes that aren't animals and fungi?
No,
No.
no. Archaeoplastids is just plants and green algae.
Oh, okay.
The things that are, so there's a historical group that's not a very good group called protists,
Mm-hmm.
and that is everything that is not a plant, fungus, or animal. But plants and fungus and animals and fungus are actually super closely related. Well, in the grand scheme of things anyway.
Mhm.
Plants are not related. It's just that we had these, protists was like a catch-all. It was like, okay, well, this isn't a plant, it isn't an animal, it isn't a fungus, let's just throw it in the protists. And that's not really a great way to make a group, which is why it's kind of an archaic term that we're not using as much anymore.
Okay.
Other questions?
Would they hear that term like recently? Because I heard that in high school.
Yeah, no, it's still being taught, but it's not a good group. So I'm trying to move away from it. In fact, when I started teaching here, I was still using protists, and I'm trying to move away from it because it's really not a very good term. And at the time, I would say this is not a very good term, but it's the term that we use, and now I'm just not even using it, except to mention that you may have heard that term before. Science is a constantly changing discipline. As we learn more and we know more, we have to adjust the way we talk about things. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. All right, so looking at the land plants, the things that are in yellow and I don't know, is that purple, magenta? What color would you call that? Purple, okay. The yellow and the purple here are the land plants. So there's two kind of major divisions between the land plants, the bryophytes and the vascular plants. And so we're gonna go through each of these groups in a little bit more detail. Again, bryophytes, what kind of a group is this? It's another paraphyletic group, right? The common ancestor of all bryophytes is also the ancestor of the vascular plants. So we do have a fair number of paraphyletic groups that we talk about in this stuff, and some of them are just hard to get away from. All right, so if we're looking at land plants, the earliest land plants started colonizing land around 400 to 500 million years ago. You can kind of see that we've gone through some various different stages. So this graph here, time is there, abundance is here. So if you're looking at this one, what's the most dominant form of plants right now? Right, click in if you haven't clicked. Maybe a few more people. We got up to 36 last time. Somebody just wants to go outside, so maybe that's it. Anybody else? All right. So right now, angiosperms are extremely abundant relative to all the other plant types. Angiosperms are the flowering plants. So plants with flowers. And that includes a lot of plants that you might not think of in your head as having flowers. Like, for example, an oak tree is a flowering plant. A grass is a flowering plant. So there's a lot of variety in flowering plants. So right now, in modern times, they're by far the most common plant type. But historically, they weren't always. We went through a period where ferns and horsetails were extremely common. We went through a period, a kind of a short period, where, I mean, if you compare this to the other different things here, these lycophytes, we'll talk about lycophytes in a second. They were pretty common. Cycads used to be much more common than they are now. I'll show you what a cycad looks like. But at the moment, angiosperms are really the most successful plant type. So let's talk about these different types. Let's start with the bryophytes. Oh, well, I said this 2 seconds ago. We do have a clicker question up there in the top. You already know, I already said this a second ago. So what type of group? Bryophytes are what type of group? Click in if you haven't clicked. Yeah, so bryophytes are a paraphyletic group. That means that they it's a group that contains the common ancestor and some but not all descendants. So the vascular plants are a descendant of the common ancestor of the bryophytes. So that does make them a paraphyletic group, but they're pretty similar to each other in a lot of ways, so we lump them all together. They are also sometimes known as the non-vascular plants. So what is that vascular? What does that sound like to you guys?
Blood.
Okay, so you think of the vascular system, right, which transports blood. Vascular actually refers to veins, or like a tube that transports something around the body, all right? So in the case of plants, vascular plants have a very complex set of tissues that move water and nutrients around the body. Non-vascular plants are still able to move water, but they do so in a less efficient way. So they're not as good at moving water around the body as a vascular plant. If you are living on land and you can't move water very efficiently, what is that going to tend to do to you? Huh? It's going to limit you. So you're going to be limited to places that are fairly moist, because you can't move water very efficiently. And you're going to be limited in your size. If you can't move water very efficiently, you can't be very large. So most bryophytes are relatively small, and they live in relatively moist areas. So the different groups of bryophytes are the liverworts. This is a liverwort. The mosses, that's probably the group you're most familiar with. And the hornworts, this is a hornwort. They all have a waxy cuticle, so they all have that cuticle that's going to prevent water loss. But they actually really need to be in moist environments. So if you, or at least an environment that is moist part of the year. So you may have seen mosses growing along creeks, or in a really shady spot of your yard, growing on like some rocks or something. They do require that to be fairly moist for at least part of the year, partly because they require water for reproduction. So there's a stage in the reproduction of bryophytes where they produce sperm and eggs, and the sperm have to actually swim from where they're produced to the location where the egg is at. We'll talk more about plant reproduction in our plant section. But just know that they have to have enough liquid water for those sperm to be swimming around, at least at some point in time during the year. So a lot of mosses are actually pretty, they can dry out, and then if they get wet again, then they'll basically come back to life. They weren't actually ever dead, but they can desiccate pretty far down and still survive that, and then when they get moist again, they can continue to grow. So some of them are able to withstand periods of dryness, but they gotta have some pretty substantial moisture at some point in time. All right, questions about that for these guys? Incidentally, if you've ever looked super close at a moss, well, actually one more thing about the mosses. We'll talk about that in the reproduction section. I'm gonna skip that for now. Yeah, I don't want to get into that right now. Okay, so let's talk about then vascular plants. So the evolution of vascular tissue, or tissue to move substances around the body of the plant, as an adaptation for living on land. Because it allows the plant to move water a greater distance, survive in a drier habitat, and really be able to persist in more environments on land. So this is a representation of, we have some fossils of very early vascular plants, and this is a representation of what those plants may have looked like. These plants did not have true roots or true leaves. So the definition of root and leaf is that there is vascular tissue within those structures. So a true root has vascular tissue in it. A true leaf has vascular tissue in it. Something that is root-like but does not have vascular tissue can be called a rhizoid, or in this case, a hair-like rooting structure. But these are not true roots because they actually did not have vascular tissue in them. Similarly, with the bryophytes, these guys didn't have any vascular tissue at all. So even though this looks like a leaf, it's actually not a true leaf. It's a leaf-like structure. Okay, that makes sense? So these earliest vascular plants had neither true roots nor true leaves. In fact, they just had photosynthetic stems. They didn't even have any leaf-like structures. They just had these stems that were photosynthetic. They were spore producing. They did have the stomata, those gaps in the cuticle that allow for gas exchange. And they did have the cuticle. So they were kind of a really simple plant. The rest of the vascular plants, the ones that are still alive today, are sometimes called the tracheophytes. Again, trachea refers, well, your trachea, right, is this tube in your throat that has ridges on it. Tracheophyte is phyte means leaf, and trachea means a tube with ridges on it, basically. So they had these tubes, this vascular tissue that allowed for movement of nutrients and water throughout the body. So again, if you're looking at the tracheophytes or the vascular plants as a whole, they are monophyletic. So here's the common ancestor of all of the vascular plants. All of these are considered vascular plants and are descended from that same common ancestor. So it is a nice monophyletic group. There's a few different categories within that. We're going to talk about lycophytes. We're going to talk about pterophytes, which are your ferns and horsetails, which is this group here, and then the seed plants. So the lycophytes are the club mosses. Here, I'm actually just going to move on to the next slide. This is the lycophyte group. They look superficially like a moss. In fact, when I was an undergrad taking ecology, everybody had to choose a group of organisms to make a scientific collection of. And in my infinite wisdom, I chose mosses. And mosses are really hard to identify. It was very, very difficult. So I had a really hard time with this collection that I had to do. So I was out in the woods all the time, looking for mosses to collect for my collection. And I stumbled across a patch of lycophytes, and I was super excited because I'm like, this is a really different looking moss. And I grabbed some up and I brought it to my professor, and he's like, it's not a moss, it's a lycophyte. And I'm like, what? What's a lycophyte? And then he showed me that they produce these spores that are actually flammable, so you can actually make a fireball. You tap the sporangium, this little cloud of spores, and you can light it.
That's awesome.
It's so awesome.
Burning bush. Burning bush.
Well, they don't get that big. They're not really bush size. They're kind of only about
Okay.
yeah. But they're, if you ever stumble across some spore producing, and you're in a non-flammable place, don't start forest fires. Try setting the spores on fire. It's kind of fun. They're actually they have a fairly wide distribution, but they're not super common. And this is a group that they do have true leaves. The leaves do have vascular tissue in them, but they don't have true roots. The roots do not have vascular tissue. So they're kind of a cool thing if you happen to stumble across a few. They used to be enormous. There used to be lycophyte trees. So this is a fossilized lycophyte stump. And this is an artist's representation of what lycophyte forests may have looked like. So the earliest forests that grew on land were actually dominated by these lycophyte trees. And in fact, most of the coal that we use now is fossilized lycophytes. That's the period of time during which the coal beds that we harvest now is forming, so that we're actually harvesting lycophyte coal forests. Yeah.
That's mainly because there was nothing involved yet to
Gaming.
consume within those structures. No fungus, no bacteria that could actually eat it, so it turned into coal.
I think it has more to do with just because I imagine that there was pretty quickly gonna be some organisms that could break that down. I don't know for certain, and those things don't fossilize terribly well, so fungus is the main thing that can break down lignin. And funguses don't fossilize terribly well. But, it's more likely that, these grew during a period of time when they fell, they just got buried, yeah. And I don't know the exact reason why that happened more then than it necessarily happens now. But most of the coal that we are using now, I know, does come from that time period. So it may be that it's been the right length of time for that to actually turn into coal versus more recent vegetation hasn't had enough time to have the chemical transformation there.
So it's still just organic.
Well, it's not exactly, it's gonna be partially carbonized, or partially fossilized, but it's just different,
Okay.
yeah. All right, so that's the lycophytes. The pterophytes, which are the ferns, horsetails, and whisk ferns, include things like this guy. This is a whisk fern. These guys don't actually have leaves, they just have photosynthetic stems. And again, they don't have true roots because they don't have vascular tissue in the root-like structures that they have. You're probably not gonna run into these guys terribly often because they pretty much only grow in the tropics. I just wanted to give you an idea of what a whisk fern looks like. Horsetails, you might run into. They do grow in the northern hemisphere. Oftentimes you find them along streams. They have these whorls of, again, these are actually photosynthetic stems. They're not actually leaves. And the horsetails are kind of interesting because they actually will lay down silica in their cell walls. So they're sometimes also known as scouring rush. Historically, they were used kind of like Brillo pads. You could grab a handful of that and use it to clean out your pots and it would scrub it nicely, which is why they're called scouring rush. Again, no true leaves, and these guys actually do have true roots though, because they do have vascular tissue in their roots. Questions about these guys? I'm just kind of trying to show you guys the diversity here. And then of course there's ferns. So ferns are the pterophyte that you're probably most familiar with because they are the most abundant of the pterophytes. They're found in a variety of different ecosystems. And there actually are fern trees. This is a fern tree that can grow, 30 feet tall. Not as big as some trees, but still pretty substantial. When they're growing, they actually will have these little, they're called fiddleheads, these little curled stems with leaves on them that gradually unfurl. These are delicious. If you find a spot where ferns are just coming up for the year, you can pick these, saute them up with a little bit of garlic. Very nice. So that's the fern. Again, probably the one you're most familiar with. And then there's a whole variety. Okay, any questions about the pterophytes? All right, these guys, the pterophytes and the lycophytes, so the club mosses and the ferns and the other things that go with the ferns, still require water for reproduction. So they're still producing a sperm that has to swim through water in order to go fertilize the egg. So these guys are still going to be dependent on having a relatively large amount of moisture at some point in time during their lifespan, all right? That brings us to the last group, which is the seed plants. And the seed plants have really taken over because they have more adaptations that allow them to survive on land and to do better on land. Number one, they produce seeds. That's why they're the seed plants. So the ferns and the lycophytes, they produce spores. And the spores can drift on the wind and go settle somewhere and germinate and grow into a new plant. Seed plants produce seeds. Seeds have a protective outer coating, and they contain food for the developing embryo. So if you think of like, most of the calories that humans consume worldwide come from a very few seed plants, namely corn, wheat, and rice, right? Those are seeds that are, that we actually use for a large portion of our nutrition, yes.
Did the seed plants come alongside the animals started to roam the land, if you will? Like, are seeds a function of like, I need this to be digested and moved out somewhere?
Seeds originally arose as an adaptation to life on land because it allows the plant to go into a dormant stage when conditions are harsh, and then germinate out of the seed. Subsequent to there was a massive radiation of animal life after seeds evolved, where animals were taking advantage of seeds.
Okay.
And then plants started taking advantage of animals to move seeds. Yeah. So there's a lot of coevolution there.
Right.
Yeah. But there's definitely you see this huge radiation of animals that happens in association with the evolution of seeds because seeds are such a good food source that lots of animals evolved to take advantage of that food source. So these seeds contain a lot of nutrition. They allow the plant to go into a dormant phase. If it's dry or if it's cold, they can survive and then germinate at a later point in time. Spores can't really do that. The other thing that seed plants have, which is a huge advantage for living on land, is that they're no longer reliant on water to get the sperm to the egg. So that they can reproduce without liquid water. So what do you think seed plant, I'm going to put it in quotes, sperm is?
Pollen?
Pollen, exactly. So we now have pollen that's able to either be transmitted through air on the wind or transmitted